A master's degree in journalism from the Ateneo de Manila University. He teaches journalism at the Ateneo's Department of Communication. He was also a fellow of the University of the Philippines, Silliman, and Iligan City National Writers Workshops. His writing has received the Catholic Mass Media Award, the Carlos Palanca Memorial Award for Literature, and the Philippines Free Press Literary Award. Let us all welcome our moderator, Mr. Ruel S. de Vera.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so happy to see so many of you here for this topic, which is very close to my heart. Nick Joaquin is my all-time greatest literary hero. And if you don't know why, you need to read him, because he is the single writer I know who can write anything well. And he is the greatest Filipino writer in English. I only met him once, and he was loud, and he was drinking. My college professor had brought him to class, and it was weird being in a school where there was a bottle of beer, because that was the deal. He would only come and talk if we gave him beer. But when I was growing up, my favorite Filipiniana book in my house was a book called Noro, Honor, and Other Profiles. A wonderful book which I hope will return to print someday because it's out of print. I read mine until it fell apart, but it was the first time I experienced literary journalism. And I grew up thinking, this is possible. And today, we have two wonderful resource people who will talk to us about the depth and the richness of Nick Joaquin. We're very happy. First of all, we have my college professor who labored, unfortunately, with a very errant student who kept submitting poetry in a fiction class. Cristina Pantoja-Hidalgo is the director of the University of Santo Tomas Center for Creative Writing and Literary Studies. Her latest book, The Thing of Feathers, will be released later this year. She has published more than 40 books of all kinds, and of course she's won the Palanca Award, the Gawad Balagtas. She is Professor Emeritus at the University of the Philippines, and she's also served as Director of the USD Publishing House. So, Dr. Cristina Pantoja-Hidalgo. Our other resource speaker was born and raised in Manila. He's a poet and a non-fiction writer who was based in New York. His latest volume of poetry is Tattered Coat. His non-fiction work includes a memoir called Eye of Fish, which won the 2002 Penn Open Book Award and the 2002 Asian American Writers Award. He writes an online column called The Arts Abroad for The Inquirer, and he's on faculty at the Asian American Studies program at Hunter College and New York University. He was recently visiting professor for creative writing at the Ateneo de Manila University. Ladies and gentlemen, Luis H. Francia. So we will begin our exploration today of Nick Joaquin with Dr. Hidalgo.
Thank you, Rui. Good afternoon, everyone. Since you mentioned it, maybe I'll add something to the bit about being your professor. He blew me away because after I gave the assignment, which was, I think, to write journal entries or something like that, he said to me, "I'm very sorry, but I can't write prose. I only ever write poetry." So I said, "Okay, you can write a journal in poetic form." The surprise of my life was that after he graduated, he became a reporter for the Daily Inquirer, covering the police bit. Okay. I hate to begin with an apology, but I'm afraid I do have to begin one this afternoon. See, I slaved over my PowerPoint presentation and discovered just 5 minutes before coming into this room that I had left it inside my car. So no PowerPoint, I'm sorry. You're going to have to listen to me as in the old days. You'll not be able to take photographs of slides on the screen, okay? I attended the earlier session with Chuck Berry Pascual here and another friend, Jack Wigley, and I thought, ang swerte-swerte naman nila, they get to just talk about their own work. And they get to be funny, and everyone had a great time. But Luigi and I have a very serious subject. Sabi nga ni Rui, the best writer in English, in Joaquin, national artist and all that. So I'm afraid like my piece is kind of serious and I have to read it pa, so I beg your indulgence. So let me begin. In my short talk, I shall be focusing on 4 points. First, the volume, variety, and quality of Nick Joaquin's creative nonfiction. Second, he's being a pioneer in some of the forms like literary reportage and the travel essay, and ahead of his time in many of his insights into Philippine culture. Third, the possibility that his creative nonfiction may well be his chief contribution to Philippine literature, perhaps outstripping his fiction, poetry, and drama. And four, the significance of his nonfiction that goes beyond its multifariousness and its innovativeness or innovation. Let me just mention Nick Joaquin's A Question of Heroes first. The essays in this book had first been published in the 60s in the Philippines Free Press. Some of this material is now common knowledge, but when those essays first appeared, it was not. History had never been written about in that way. About Father Jose Burgos, for example, Joaquin wrote that on his way to the scaffold, he wept like a child. But he also wrote, the frustration was so violent because of the impetus of his ambition and the speed of his advance. It was a headlong career from the start. He was still to be ordained when he competed for a parish and won it, though he could not take possession because he was still not a priest. I don't know how this happened. When he did become a priest, his first parish was, right off, the Cathedral of Manila. Later, the historians attacked the book for taking liberties with history, for failing to document each claim and allusion, for including the author's opinions on the historical personages and events. All of these were regarded as little short of crimes, as was perhaps what was taken as irreverence towards these men who were, after all, our heroes. But of course, the essays were meant to humanize those men, not to shoot them down. And in humanizing them, he actually made them more, not less, admirable. In the same manner that Homer, in creating his flawed human heroes, made them more heroic than the gods. They lived in dangerous times and they rose to the occasion, triumphing over their own imperfections. In 1967, the Ateneo Press published the book Brown Heritage, edited by Antonio Manood. Nick Joaquin wrote a long review of it, which is included in his own book, Culture as History. As cultural criticism, it antedates Rey Ileto's Pasión at Revolución by more than a decade. Not to mention the courses on cultural theory taught in university literature programs today. These two books are only a small part of Nick Joaquin's total nonfiction output, and yet, as noted by Lito Zulueta in 2009, quote, save for one or two token essays, most literary anthologies focus on his fiction, poetry, and drama, ignoring completely his nonfiction. And this despite the fact that the Ramon Magsaysay Award he received in 1996 was for journalism, literature, and creative communication. Actually, this neglect simply reflects the predicament of journalism and of the essay as a literary form in the rest of the world too, until only recently. Tom Wolfe is credited with having invented the term new journalism to describe what he and other writers like himself, like Norman Mailer and Truman Capote, were doing in the 1960s. That is, introducing literary techniques and the personal voice into their nonfiction. The veteran journalist and author William Zinsser now refers to that time as the beginning of the golden era of creative nonfiction and credits the following magazines with having fueled it: Life, Harper's, which published Capote's In Cold Blood in 1966, and The New Yorker, which commissioned Norman Mailer's The Armies of the Night in 1968. Scholars were slow to go where magazine editors knew the readers were queuing up. As Norman Sims says, the scholars from the 50s and the 60s that Tom Wolfe called the literary gentleman in the grandstand considered journalism a lowlife, unworthy of representation alongside the novel and poetry. Returning the favor, literary journalists of the 60s expressed disdain for the community of literary scholarship. Wolfe went so far as to offend critics by suggesting that nonfiction would supplant the novel. According to Lee Gutkind, when he first proposed teaching a course in creative nonfiction in the University of Pittsburgh in the early 70s, he was nearly laughed out of the room. By the 90s, however, new journalism or literary journalism or creative nonfiction was dominating not just the magazines but the bookshelves. Here in the Philippines, Nick Joaquin, in his Ramon Magsaysay lecture in 1996, claimed that as a journalist in the 50s and 60s, he had hoped to create a journalism of his own. 50s and 60s. As creative as any poem or novel. He added that these efforts of his antedated the new journalism in the US, just as his own brand of magic realism antedated the magic realism of the American Latinos. And he did it mainly in the Philippines Free Press every week without fuss or fanfare. The lecture titled Journalism versus Literature, that was his acceptance speech for the Ramon Magsaysay Awards, was published in the Philippine Graphic in 1990, but it did not cause much of a stir. And yet I believe it is one of the most important statements by a Filipino writer about contemporary Philippine literature and about the contemporary writing scene in the world at large. Quote, "The literary snobs disdaining of journalism is a thing of the past, now that the greatest literary artists are producing reportage." This is what he announced. And he went further. If journalism has been upgraded to literature, literature is being reinvented as a species of reportage. His own career, he claimed, followed that trajectory, from fiction to reportage, and from reportage to non-fiction as literature. And he predicted that the world 2000 would be the best of journalism, the territory of non-fiction. Using his famous nom de plume, Quijano de Manila, Joaquin wrote 12 small books of reportage. You have some of them here on the table. 6 of which were published in 1977 by National Bookstore. Cheap paperback newsprint editions sold at, surprise, 12 pesos and 50 centavos each. The intention was obviously to reach a much larger audience than those who usually bought literary titles. I happened to be home when the first 2 books were launched at, I believe, the Harrison Plaza, then a new mall, and I was amazed at the size of the crowd. "Are all these people here for a book launch?" I asked Chato Garcellano. And deadpan, she replied, "Kumalat daw ang balita na ikakasal si Nick kay Nora Honor." Of course, the people were there for Nora Honor. And at least some of them, I hope, bought some books. It was probably the first time that a serious writer, that's in quotations, took on the type of subject matter found in these little volumes. For example, from Ronnie Poe, Batang Takilya, to Exorcism. From the iconic columnist Doroy Valencia to the oracles of Quiapo. From boxing champion Flash Elorde. I don't expect that any of you know any of these names, no? Pero, kilala naman niyo si Flash Elorde. Okay, ay sa gym daw. To the historic origins of the names of city streets, from Manila fashions to cockfighting in the Araneta Coliseum. Way before popular culture became a buzzword in academe, Nick Joaquin had made it his turf. A quick glance through these little volumes is enough to give one a startling glimpse into the quality of his mind. Nora Honor and Other Profiles contains the landmark expose by Rod Reyes, a 25-year-old reporter who had posed as a junkie or a dope addict to get into the vice dens. The story earned him death threats, required him to have bodyguards, forced him to sleep away from home sometimes, but it also aroused, I'm quoting here from Nick, not only public horror, but official action. That was in 1961. And even then, the young hero of the day, described by Joaquin as a small, slight, sad-looking chap with spectacles, a large nose, and cropped hair, wondered if these addicts should be treated as criminals, or as sick people, or as lost souls. In view of what's happening in our country today, this is very germane. Amalia Fuentes and Other Etchings contains Anding Roses plays James Bond, an account of the rescue of the original manuscripts of Rizal's two novels and the El Último Adiós by then Secretary of Education Alejandro Roses, a tale which reads like a spy thriller. And Alfredo Saulo, Down from the Hills, in the book Gloria Diaz and Other Delineations, is a sensitive portrait of the newsman, labor leader, and former member of the Hukbalahak, who during his trial in 1958 was already claiming that a communist party has the right to exist in a democratic country because it is a necessary adjunct to the right to free speech of the people who believe in communism. A fascinating piece in Dog Lion and Other Cameos, Dog Lion is Jose Garcia Villa, of course, is a short essay paying tribute to a popular singer whom I know you will not remember because he was singing before you were born, Eddie Mesa, once called the Elvis Presley of the Philippines. Of him, Joaquin says that he is underrated as pop. But like pop music, he is adventurous, he develops, he has reached third base. And the description of the man's impromptu performance in a bar and its effect on the stunned audience is a real bravura piece. Manila, Sin City, and Other Chronicles, and The Language of the Streets were published in 1980. Using slightly better quality paper, but poor quality binding, so that now they have fallen apart. The former includes the hilarious but also immensely informative history of the local motel culture in the essay Short Time Checks Out, and an unusual tour of Manila's brothels, massage parlors, strip joints, gambling joints, and other dens of iniquity in Manila. Calle Azcárraga, which is about the old landmarks bordering this street, Azcárraga pa ba ngayon or it's called something else? Recto ba yun ngayon? Okay. But it expands to become a paean to the city and its storied past. Anvil Publishing has now reissued 4 of the Quijano de Manila Chronicles, here they are, reportage on politics and reportage on the Marcoses, both initially published in 1981. I particularly like the essay Take Over in Manila from the politics book, which, besides providing a character sketch of Mayor Antonio Villegas and offering up his observations on the resurgence, also offers up his observations on the resurgence of idealistic politicians of the Magsaysay era. This is Raul Manglapos and company. And the essay, this is my true favorite, The Ballet Dancer and the Refugee from Lovers, is about that star-crossed pair, Tita Laya, the Filipina ballerina and professor, and the man she fell in love with, Ante Radaik, the Croatian refugee, who, in the words of Joaquin, quote, might be a character out of Hemingway or Remarque, one of those maimed fugitives who smell of fear and death, and whose sickness not even love can cure. That's why it's my favorite. And there's the improbable gun duel at LBM in Reportage on Crime, which chronicles an actual shootout, American cowboy style, between an actor called Boy Santa Romana and a policeman. Santa Romana belonged to the iconic movie The Low Waist Gang, published, which showed in 1956 with Fernando Poe Jr., Zoldy Shornack, and Bobby Gonzalez, who styled themselves on James Dean. You've heard of him? I'm asking because there's a huge gap between me and my students today, growing larger by the minute. When I started out, I was 19, teaching in college, and some of my students were older than I was. They were a gang in real life too, itong lowest gang. And the roles they played extended into real life. Joseph Estrada, yes, him, was also part of the gang. The essay, however, doesn't report what happened in that studio. It provides insights into Pinoy, doesn't only record what happened in the studio, it provides insights into Pinoy cinema and Pinoy movie idols. Now, so enough about those 12 volumes. There is another book, a longer work, called Quartet of the Tiger Moon, published in 1986, a detailed, gripping account of EDSA 1. There are 5 collections of long essays, including The Loving, Lovely Manila, My Manila, 1991, which is subtitled A History for the Young. So it's a history of the Philippines, but written with a very young, so parang YA. Kaya lang hindi siya fiction. YA, non-fiction. And more than a dozen biographies. And of course, there's the amazing Almanac for Manileños, 1979, which the author described as, quote, a calendar, a weather chart, a sanctoral, a zodiac guide, and a mini encyclopedia on the world of the Manileño, adding that it was unique in that, unlike the almanacs of old, it was for the urban user. But this modest description does not do the book justice. Far from being a pamphlet like its predecessors, it is a handsome coffee table book, abundantly illustrated by photographs, both old and new, pen and ink drawings, and woodcut prints. The book designer's choice of sepia-colored paper, page design, page borders, fonts, and other artworks has produced a vintage effect, and the author has hewed close to the original concept of the ancient almanacs. However, it is not intended for consultation on any single year. Rather, it will serve as a boon companion every day of every year. It is full of information, some of it fairly commonplace, like the birthstones of each month, some useful, such as instructions on how to make lanzones pills, fumigants, some curious, like trivia about tutors, much of it fascinating, like the history of Marikina shoe industry and how bacalao came to be associated with Lent, and some of it extremely esoteric, like what movies were showing in Manila theaters the day that President Quezon and Vice President Osmeña were sworn in. Meron pang mga basketball games, lots of other things. The horoscope sections in the volume are tongue-in-cheek, even if strangely prescient. For example, mga Virgo ba dito? The Virgo heart is a lonely hunter, hermit, explorer, pilgrim, pioneer, but always a naturalist. And every Virgo person is in spirit a primitive. Taurus and Virgo are allied signs, and both produce sensualists who are austere in taste, materialists who lust after the spiritual, and egotists who would impose their unselfish service on others. As you can see, no other horoscope approximates anything like this. No? Hindi ko na babasahin yung iba, pero they're really something. To give you, this however, lapit na ako dun sa end. To give you a clearer idea of how Nick Joaquin's art as a literary journalist works, I would refer to you to one essay titled The Pinoy as Tippler. It is an excellent example of Nick Joaquin's literary journalism. its flavor, its liveliness, its humor, its careful attention to concrete evocative details, and its imaginative verve. But first, let me return briefly to that Nick Joaquin lecture I mentioned. In it, he recalls how scandalized Manila's literati were when, as a promising young poet and short story writer, he decided to become a journalist, and in effect, to sell out. Journalism was considered hack writing, where the literary snobs were concerned, but, he said, he needed a good paying job, and he had no exalted ideas about himself as a creative writer. Creative writers had valuable lessons to learn from reporters, Nick said. They tended to be too subjective, too self-absorbed, too self-indulgent. That's why I think every aspiring young writer should spend some years as a news reporter, right, Ruel? So he will be obliged to step out of his own private world and to experience the world outside. This will not only train him to be observant and objective, it will also save him from eccentricity, the danger that faces every creative writer. The newsman cannot afford to be eccentric. Eccentricity is such a temptation for the creative writer, in the Philippines especially, where so few read him. He may be tempted to indulge his fancies and his foibles. He feels under no obligation to communicate clearly because he knows that the readers are mostly his fellow writers and that he can play games with them. But what journalism demands is responsible writing. By the way, he also added that the journalists would benefit from contact with creative writers because, for one thing, they are ungrammatical. The absence of the personal pronoun I makes Joaquin different from today's young writers of creative nonfiction and distinguishes him even from Wolf and Mailer et al. In fact, he invented a different persona altogether for much of his journalism, his alter ego, Quijano de Manila. The careful reader will see that though the I seems absent, in fact, everything is filtered through his lenses. Sometimes the I is thinly disguised behind the ubiquitous we or one or you. And of course, the details, that is, the amount of information presented and the manner of its presentation, the choice of words, the tone, the sentiment, are all unmistakable Nick Joaquin. I would, if I could, take you through the essay, but there's no time. So I just mentioned that the essay is part of a book, I'm talking about the Pinoy Stipler, titled History in the Brewing, published by San Miguel Corporation as part of its centennial celebration. We can assume that it was a commissioned work. And by the way, even today we have a tendency to say that writers, creative writers who write and the commissioned work are selling out. But I think it serves as an admirable illustration of Nick Joaquin's own dictum. If you look down on your material, if you despise it, you'll do a hack job. But journalism trained me never to feel to feel superior to whatever I was reporting, and always to respect an assignment, whether it was a basketball game or a political campaign or a fashion show or a murder case or a movie star interview. In the short piece, we have a showcase of the craft of both the poet and the reporter, the narrative skill of the fictionist, and the analytical skill of the essayist. Both the historical sense that is most often mentioned in praise of Nick Joaquin, and the immersion in pop culture, which is sometimes overlooked, and the considerable erudition served up in a light, graceful, entertaining style, emphasis on entertaining, which of course is what Nick Joaquin himself always expected literature to be, whether it be fiction or non-fiction. It seems to me that the significance of all of Nick Joaquin's creative nonfiction has a deeper source than the journalist's commitment to impart information or the raconteur's desire to entertain. or the novelist's offering up of beautiful thoughts in beautiful language. It lies in its deeper wisdom and in its truest commitment. I refer to literature as myth-making. More than 147 years ago, I wrote about the lack of a large body of what we might call city fiction in our literature in English. I wondered why, despite its diversity, its density, its multi-leveled culture, and its being surely one of the most interesting cities in Asia, Manila had not produced what is generally called city fiction. For all that most of our writers in English are Manila-based, Manila does not seem to play a central role in our fiction in English. By city fiction, I don't just mean fiction where the setting is the city, but fiction where the city figures as one of the characters in the story, where it where it shapes the destiny of the characters, propels the action, and to a certain extent determines its outcome. In short, I was referring to myth-making about the city, fiction that contributes to the city's mythology. With a few notable exceptions, like Frankie Sionil Jose and Francisco Arcellana and Jose Dalisay, and among the younger writers, Lacambini Sitoy and Sarch Lacuesta, this vivid sense of time and place was missing from much of our fiction in English. Nick Joaquin himself had this explanation. Quote, "When I started writing in the late 1930s, I was aware enough of our milieu to know that it was missing totally from our writing in English. The Manila I had been born into and had grown up in had yet to appear in our fiction, especially our English fiction, although that fiction was mostly being written in Manila and about Manila. The place names were familiar enough, but they conjured up no city to trigger a shock of recognition in a Manileño like me. It seemed as if the city itself, the Manila I knew, had become invisible to our writers in English." As I suggested in that earlier essay of mine, perhaps what is lacking in our writers in English is a sense of their city's history. Are our younger writers deeply steeped in their city's history, Chuck Berry? How much of its culture, and this includes its pop culture, have they absorbed? If they have no awareness of the city's mythology, how can they possibly contribute to it? And if they do not, how can that mythology possibly survive? A city's mythology is created as much by the people who actually lived in it as by the artists who have imagined it. A city without memories, a city without myths, cannot inspire affection, nor can it inspire art. It is finally to Nick Joaquin again that we must turn to find the most fully imagined sense of the city. In that essay, my earlier essay, it was Nick Joaquin's second novel, Cave and Shadows, that I used as an example of city fiction par excellence. But it is in his creative non-fiction, I think, that Joaquin is truly Manila's chronicler. And this is the importance of an almanac for Manileños. It is all of a piece with the rest of Nick Joaquin's work, a true tour de force, the high note in his love song for his city. And here, no critic can say, as they have sometimes said of his fiction and his drama, that it is antiquarian or dated. This body of work, Quijano de Manila's record of his city, remains as fascinating today as it was riveting when it was first read. The language is at once gritty and elegant, the voice is vibrant and strong and true, and the vision is sharp and steady and whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hidalgo. Now, Luis Francia.
That's a tough act to follow, but I'll do my best. I think just from what Jean was saying, perhaps we can think of Nick Joaquin as a Renaissance man. He was a multifaceted, deeply engaged, complex, and fun-loving personality. He was open to all disciplines, and so because of his openness, he was able to use his wonderfully amazing various subjects, from A to Z. So I think, and there's a tradition of Renaissance writers that goes all the way back, and I think we should imagine Nick as part of that tradition. He's individual, but at the same time, he belongs to the humanist tradition of, and maybe his scholastic training, maybe as a seminarian, and his upbringing by his parents exposed him to this love of learning, no matter what the field was. And I think that explains a lot of his appeal across all classes and generations. And then the second thing I'd like to add to what Jane was saying is that certainly I find it hard to think of people who would describe his fiction as dated. It's certainly set in a particular place and time, but that doesn't make it dated. For instance, if you think of Moby Dick, takes place in the 19th century, but no one with a proper understanding of literature would say that that's dated. On the other hand, you have contemporary fiction, which is dated because they're tied into plots, not so much the language. And I think what I'll talk about today really is the language that Nick Joaquin uses in his short stories particularly. And there we find his inventiveness and his love for language, which I think underlies all his efforts, whether in nonfiction or in poetry or in fiction or in his drama. It's really the love of language that informs him as a writer, as it should, any writer. The infatuation with words, the sense of wordplay, the linguistic mastery. These are all the elements that a writer seeks to convey and to achieve the mastery of, the achieve of, as Gerard Manley Hopkins would put it. It's actually, I think, the title of an anthology of poetry that Genia Bud is editing and is supposed to come out soon. So I think Nick, he was easygoing as a person, but I'm sure as a writer he was very disciplined. So it was this kind of interesting contrast between the public persona and the private persona, which is where you really encounter the writer. I think also there's a very Catholic sense. Well, I've labored, now it's time to enjoy myself. Usually, oh, by the way, where is the beer? Really? But anyway, so I'd like to maybe focus, because there's so many aspects of Joaquin as a writer that of course it's impossible to get into all of them. We probably require a course, maybe several years. But the best thing to do, of course, is to buy the books. And here I'm pitching for Anvil. Because if we don't buy his books, how will he survive? How will he live on? He must live on in us, in our knowledge and love of his words. It's easy to say, oh yeah, I love Nick Joaquin, but actions speak louder than words. So certainly Nick will only live if each generation takes him as their own. And I would say there is a lot in Nick that every generation can take as their own. And so with regards to short stories, to me, they're really the epitome of his strength as a writer. But before I go into that, I just wanted to say in terms of journalism that when we were growing up, and I would read certainly the Free Press, and I always admired his writing, and I never thought of it as anything less than good writing. It happened to be about people who were alive, real stories, and And that, was really incidental because he was a storyteller. And so he would see the story and write the story, whether it was imagined or based on reality. And so moving to New York, I happened to start writing for the Village Voice, and the Voice, Nick Joaquin would have loved the Voice because most of the writing for the Voice was what we call, personal journalism, as opposed to the New York Times, which was, you could never find the I in the New York Times, that it was always very kind of distanced, and the Voice was the alternative. And so I got, having read Nick Joaquin, this was not new to me. So I kind of felt, in retrospect, that Nick Joaquin set the stage, so it wasn't difficult for me to get into the mode of writing where I was present as well. There was no guilt. And of course, the standard journalism courses, you're supposed to absent yourself. And as a writer, I keep thinking, why should I absent myself? If a story really engages me, I'd like to show that engagement. You might call it egotism, which is fine. You can call it whatever you choose to call it. But as a writer, one engages with one's material. And I think Nick, it was very clear. So when he goes to history, of course people were shocked because he was, violating all the rules. And that's what a good writer does. You upset the apple cart, You make people stand up and scream. You make them sit up and wake up, And then they start to reevaluate their own criteria. So when we come to the short story and Joaquin's use of language, I think it's important to note that he, as many of the writers of his generation, and certainly of Jose Garcia Villa, they came of age when English was relatively new to the Philippines. And it was still an age where Spanish was very strong, its influence certainly, if not its literature. And therefore they were in between. They had the riches of both available. Those writers had the riches of both traditions available, as well as the pre-colonial traditions, which I think Nick really mined in many of his stories. And so the question for writers pre-World War II was, how do we write in a language that's new to the Philippines? How do we write in a way that transcends mimesis, imitation? How do we write in a way that where we find our own voice, where it's indisputably Filipino? Indisputably written in a voice that cannot be found anywhere else. And so Nick, as a writer, faced that question. And many feel that he was an apologist for the Spanish colonial period. And I think that's a misreading. He certainly acknowledged the depth and breadth of the Spanish influence on the Filipino psyche. But his real subject was the Filipino psyche in all its complexities. And that included a great deal of Spanish influence. Look at our names, Hispanic, most of them. Nick Joaquin, that's a Hispanic name. I remember this anthologist in New York. He had never heard of Philippine literature. And he was doing an anthology of Latino literature. So he started looking for Latino literary names, and he came across a number of Filipino-American authors like Anvil Gonzalez and Bienvenido Lumbera, and said, well, I've never heard of these Latino authors. And, he discovered Philippine literature, Filipino-American and Philippine literature, including Nick Joaquin. And then I happened to meet him, and we've remained in touch. And so the fact that he first thought we were somehow a forgotten tribe of Latino writers living in some remote archipelago, this was new to him. So Nick Joaquin I think was never an apologist for the colonial period, but he explored it, he mined it, and you can see that in his stories. And of course, one of the stories, one of my favorites, is Summer Solstice. To those of you who've read it, I think you'll agree it's powerful, it's sexy, and it's quite feminist, you know. And it looks at both the Spanish patriarchal values in place and the indigenous emphasis on matriarchy. And those of you who haven't read it, I definitely recommend it as one of the few stories of his that really, if you have to read 2 or 3, that would be one of those selections. And the other story that I'd like to talk about is Ambiguous Apocalypse, which is actually, and I think it's been reissued as it's almost a novella. It's actually probably the longest short story he wrote. Okay. And so, and it's a deeply complex story. But before I get to that, let me just discuss some more Summer Solstice. And Summer Solstice, you know, has this, and it's set in Manila, by the way, in Paco. And the family that is drawn, the portrait of the family that's drawn, is an upper middle class family. You know, they have a carriage, they have a wonderful home, they have a driver, they have a maid. The maid happens to be the Tagterin, which is the festival that celebrates the female principle. And it takes place on the same day as the summer solstice and also the feast of St. John, San Juan's fiesta. So you have the feast of St. John, which is described very masculine terms. And let me just read a portion of that. And so Doña Lupeng and Don Paeng are being driven to one of the grandfather's homes with the children. And so they go through the procession, and this is the way Joaquin describes the procession. Up the road, steering a cloud of dust, and gaily bedrenched by the crowds gathered along the wayside, a concourse of young men clad only in soggy trousers were carrying aloft an image of the precursor, that's St. John the Baptist. Their teeth flashed white in their laughing faces, and their hot bodies glowed crimson as they pranced past, shrouded in fiery dust, singing and shouting and waving their arms. The St. John riding swiftly above the sea of dark heads and glittering in the noon sun. A fine, blonde, heroic St. John, very male, very arrogant, the Lord of summer, indeed, the Lord of light and heat, erect and goldly virile above the prone and female earth, while the worshippers danced and the dust thickened and the animals reared and roared and the merciless fires came raining down from the skies, the vast outpouring of light that marks this climax of the solar year, raining relentlessly upon field and river and down and winding road, upon the joyous throng of young men against whose uproar a couple of seminarians in muddy cassocks vainly intoned the hymn of the noon god. And it goes on. And interestingly, before that, there's the scene between Antoy, the driver of their household, and Doña Lupeng. And Doña Lupeng is asking, why is your wife, what's happened to her? And normally you beat her, but this time you're like avoiding her. And so she asks him, you know, why don't you beat her? And he says, it is the day of St. John, the spirit is in her. But man, it is true, Senora, the spirit is in her. She is the Tadterin. She must do as she pleases. Otherwise the grain would not grow, the trees would bear no fruit, the rivers would give no fish, and the animals would die. Naku, I did not know your wife was so powerful and toy. At such times, she is not my wife. She is the wife of the river. She is the wife of the crocodile. She is the wife of the moon. So the setting is set for this amazing ending because part of the story involves a relative, a young man who's been to Europe, kind of like Rizal. He's an ilustrado. And he comes back and he has different ideas about women. You know, he's liberated. And he gets down on his knees and kisses the feet of Doña Lupe. And of course she's shocked. You know, and we can imagine her saying, "Que barbaridad, que pasa, hombre." But she's secretly stimulated because at the end of the story, you know, and I won't give you all the details, you can read that for yourself, she commands the husband to adore her and to kiss her feet. And you know, he's normally this macho guy, and finally he collapses and says, "Okay," and he crawls on the floor. And this is the ending. It's a powerful ending. She raised her skirts and contemptuously thrust out a naked foot. He lifted his dripping face and touched his bruised lips to her toes, lifted his hands and grasped the white foot and kissed it savagely, kissed the step, the sole, the frail ankle, while she bit her lips and clutched in vain at the window sill. Her body distended and racked by horrible shivers, her head flung back and her loose hairs streaming out the window, streaming fluid and black in the white night, where the huge moon glowed like a sun, and the dry air flamed into lightning, and the pure heat burned with immense fever of noon. That's the way the story ends, and it's great because you're wondering, well, what about the next morning? You know, will you still kiss her feet? And I was hoping, I hope so. But you know, it's the way he develops the story. You know, he interweaves the two subject matters, which is patriarchy imposed by the Spanish and the indigenous past. So when he looks at the influence of the Spanish, he doesn't do so at the expense of the indigenous. He looks at the relationship between the two. And we see this much more in Candido's Apocalypse. And it's a really interesting story. It's quite deep, and I've read and reread it like 3 times, and I'm still puzzling over why the main character, Bobby, you know, becomes Candido. And as Candido, he sees people around him completely naked. Okay? And he's like wondering, why am I seeing, you know, he sees his mother, she's naked. He sees his father, he's naked. He sees his professors, they're all naked, and he can see in one man's case, you know, I think he has hernia. So he tells her, "Sir, you know, why is it hanging so low?" It's like, he's furious, and he's like, "You better wait here, I'll call the prefect of discipline." And he sees, you know, young men, young women, old men, old women, everyone naked as Candido. So he keeps scratching his head and wondering, what is happening to me? And so that's his apocalypse. He sees, and I believe part of it is that the tone of the story, the language used, is very American in its intonations. You know, the daughter, his sister will say, "I hate you," you know, mom and dad. And, you know, I never heard a family in Manila as Americanized as they are using that kind of slang. So it's a deliberate ploy by Joaquin to bring in these Americanisms. And then Bobby, he belongs to a gang called the Vultures or the Vampires, I forget which. And there's a part of him that kind of feels that this is all a put on. And he sees beneath that, and he doesn't quite know why. You know, he's like obsessed. He's seized by this force that seeks to unveil, literally and figuratively, the pretenses we have as a society. So it's a story that I want to keep on reading because there are layers within the story that it's quite intriguing, and it speaks to the different themes that I think Joaquin explores in his nonfiction as well, particularly in his essays on history. There's the level where we think of our heroes as idealized figures, but he can see that they have no clothes, so to speak. He sees them as human. He sees the faults. And it's not to render them any less, but it's to make us realize that they were once upon a time like us. And in fact, that's more encouraging, because if they are human and they can be seen as heroes, well, then that opens up possibilities for us as well. So, in his use of language is where I feel his paramount strength lies. Without language, without his craft, he would not have been the master that he is. His journalism would not have been the way it is, nor his nonfiction or his fiction. And I see them all in a continuing spectrum. I actually don't like to distinguish in writing between nonfiction and fiction. They're all either good writing or bad writing. And most of what he wrote was very good, and in some cases, world class and top notch. Thank you.
Thank you, Luigi. And I think that I would like to start off by asking Jane a question, which is, many of the young people now, when I introduce Nick Joaquin to them, their comments are always, one, we only ever read him in school. So they think of him as required reading, which of course is the death knell for coolness of an author if they have to read him in school. But even though the ones who like him, they say that it's not so much that he's dated, but that he's old-fashioned as a writer. How do you feel about that observation? Because it's a pejorative. They think that it's a bad thing and it's old-fashioned, but I don't agree with that. But what do you think about that observation?
Of course, I've encountered the same thing in my classes, no? And to mention also NPM Gonzalez, no, we all teach. The reaction to him is the same, although the style of NBM is so different from Nick, no? I remember one student who was assigned, graduate students ito, so you would think they'd not be so impatient with the old men. He had to report on an NBM novel, in Season of Grace. And then before starting, he said to me, "Ma'am, I know I'm supposed to have enjoyed the novel. I know he's a great writer, but it's like being in the slow cycle of a washing machine." So I think that to a certain extent, I absolutely agree with Luigi that Nick Joaquin is not dated. But see, the idiom has changed. We have to face up to that, I think. And the pace of the stories of the older writers is really different from the pace of the stuff that the younger people, like the millennials, of course, they read. No? But mabilis everything's fast. No? So it's very difficult to get the students to appreciate Nick's style, beautiful though it might be. And they're all like, they always say that what they know is required, which is to praise Nick Joaquin, because national artist, etc. So they'll say, I am so impressed with the language. When we interview yung mga young people applying to be instructors, and then what do you read? And of course they will say Shakespeare, and then Filipino writers, Nick Joaquin, Jose Rizal, di ba? So yeah, how to bridge the gap? Truly, I don't know.
I find, yeah.
Although, I remember, how did I first learn the classics? Through illustrated comics. Yung classic illustrated comics, no? Where the style is not very obvious, but where the story can sweep them along, the readers. No? So we did have a project, April, remember, in the creative writing center then of UP, where we chose certain stories and we had them translated into Filipino by some of the best young writers, and then it was going to be translated into comic book form. Summer Solstice was one of them. Kaya lang, the project got shut down. I thought it was a good idea actually. Because that's one way to get the students. Nabasa nila sa comics. Parang yung mga Hamlet, mga Macbeth. I first read them as comics. So they will not have a problem following the meaning and that they can not worry about all the trimmings. Pero it was shut down and I think you can guess why. It would be too expensive. Kasi the marketing person of the UP press said, mahal-mahal niyan, di ba? Kasi kailangan color. Kasi magko-compete dun sa mga foreign comic book. So, there it went. What I try to do is find what in Nick Joaquin they will more easily appreciate. And again, I go back to the nonfiction. Because his language in the essays, the reportage especially, while it remains beautiful, is trimmed somewhat. Diba? It's faster also, like yung quartet of the Tiger Moon. Mabilis ang pace in keeping with how the events were happening in EDSA. Tapos postmodern kasi apat-apat na narratives all happening at the same time. No? So yun, pag they read it na and they enjoyed it, I think they're more willing. And then the poetry, di ba? Poetry is short eh. Di ba? Yung woman who had two neighbors, naku, di ba? Tapos sabi nila, nasa page 3 pa, nandun pa rin sa yung naglalakad na hubad na babae, ano ba yan? So, they begin with a poem which moves them along kasi, di ba, mga love, mga ganon. And the journalism, and then they're more willing to, sige na nga, basahin na rin natin May Day Eve, di ba? Gusto nila yung May Day Eve, yata. Hindi nila masyado maintindihan yung Summer Solstice, baka di ba? Pero yung May Day Eve na merong kung titingin ka sa mirror, makikita mo yung demonyo sa likod mo, yung pala yung asawa mo, di ba? Yun, mas na nila, kasi spec fit. Di ba? So, I try to find what it is, what is the possible key to making them understand Nick. Because I do think they should.
I find that the idea of Nick Joaquin in comics to be interesting because the first piece of fiction of Nick's that I ever read was comics, the Three Generations and Portrait. So they were both done, it was those black and white classics illustrated that was local. And I remember reading it and it was so different from the other stuff, and then I realized that it was a Filipino writer. So that would be a great idea, like just reprinting that. Also, I find that the best way to get people to appreciate Nick Joaquin now is just to thrust reportage of lovers, on lovers into their hands and just make them read it. Because I think it's the most modern of yeah. Rod Reyes. That's in Nora Honor and other profiles, which I adored. And I can't believe that he sort of became a drug addict, so he could write about.
He was afraid
He was
that he
afraid.
would become.
Yeah.
He did reputate it.
Luigi, I have a question connected to what Jing was saying. So, you said earlier that you don't like sort of separating fiction from nonfiction. You know, I kind of look at Nick Joaquin's work like that. Like, if you study Nick Joaquin, you don't just wind up studying just one aspect of him. It's like all of his stuff is like a collective Nick Joaquin-ness. So what do you think about that?
Well, I agree with you. But as a writer, when I write poetry or nonfiction, it's the same sensibilities I bring to it. It's like driving, say poetry would be what? A convertible, 8 horsepower engine, and nonfiction would be something else, a different craft, but it's the same driver. So I think it's really for critics, because they're more comfortable with dividing things rather than synthesizing things. So my critical stance towards critics is the opposite direction. If I'm to read a writer, I want, and I like the writer, I read whether it's poetry or prose, fiction, novels, nonfiction. aware of this particular writer's strengths, predilections, so to me, it's really maybe a marketing thing. If most people don't buy poetry, I mean, otherwise, I probably could make much more money. Unfortunately, this is not the age of poetry. But if that weren't around, then people would have a harder time. So, in a way, it's kind of making up people's minds for them, and saying, okay, here's a good story, read it. And so, to me, these divisions are not really relevant to the writing.
I also would like to point out that one of the things that you should look for is Nick Joaquin in film. Because Tatarin came out years ago, and almost nobody outside the academe and the writing committee knew it was Nick Joaquin. All they knew it was Rica Peralejo, and that's what they knew about it, and that she was naked in it. And people sort of, and now that's why when Larawan comes out, you should go see it. All right. For me, whenever I meet young people who have not read Nick Joaquin, I just go, he is the OG Filipino rock star writer. You need to read him right now. Okay, so, questions please about this very interesting topic.
What travel essays by Nick Joaquin can you recommend for starters, especially for people who love traveling and blogging about travels? Because I think that's the in thing right now.
Yes, ma'am. Question.
Actually, I'm glad you brought it up because he was the pioneer. He was the first one to write travel essays. Well, of course, the real pioneer is Jose Rizal. I think pioneer siya in everything. I don't include it. Writing for children, comic books, pioneer, feminism, yung campaign for Tagalog or Filipino over English, siya yun. So yung later on, si Nick Joaquin, and unfortunately, I'll have to tell you, they're not available anymore. Kasi they were published in the Philippines Free Press, which was closed down nung nag-martial law. So, ang maganda pa dun sa mga sinulat niya, at that time, meron pang Iron Curtain. Do you know what that is?
Yeah.
The Iron Curtain and the Bamboo Curtain, yung communist world, at saka yung free world. Doon tayo sa free world, diba, with America. So, si Nick joined a group of writers, I think, who visited Russia. Hindi ka makakuha ng visa sa Russia noon. And China, then called Red China. And Cuba. And he wrote about those places. So to begin with, they were new. I mean, we were reading things that we didn't know about, di ba? And also, yun na nga yung style. And what a wonderful model for travel writing. Talagang, ang ganda. You know what I first heard about Big Peking Duck or Beijing Duck? From Nick Joaquin. Detailed description of what this dish was about and how it is eaten. Kaya nung nagpunta na ako dun sa mga, dati walang Beijing Duck naman dito sa Chinatown, di ba? Doon lang kami, doon lang sa Binondo kumakain. When I first tasted it, it was in Bangkok. And in my mind was that description of Nick Joaquin. So you're actually correct. Wonderful way to start sana. I've been telling Andrea, Anvil, director, na yung travel essay sana, kasi never published in book form.
Hi, Charo.
Anyway, there is a compilation. According to the Loxines, it's all, what did they do? You can research. They have the compilation of the free press. The old, according to the Loxines themselves.
Kasi we tried, I don't know, of course that's for you young researchers to look for them. At the time that I was still heading UP Press, hinahanap talaga namin yan. Hindi namin mahanap.
Well,
Sa library nga.
even before Tito passed away, he said, the Loxine said, yes.
That's good to know.
Yes, it
Kasi
is there.
We would go to the library, UP library, sometimes yung, meron silang
microfiche.
No. The actual
Yes.
hard copies, the magazines, they do it.
Wow.
And then you'd get to that page, kasi sa table of contents, or page 40, pagdating mo doon, it had been torn. Some students who were resigned, no? And there's another thing, if I may add, so that you look for it na rin, yung at the end of each year, Luigi, do you remember? He would do a parang summary, wrap-up of everything that happened for the year in the Philippines. Kasama doon yung bagong slang, yung mga result ng mga basketball games, yung mga pelikula, mga ganyan. Plus, of course, other things. No? And that was something I look forward to every year. Lalabas yun, I think, in January for the past year. That one also we found, hirap na hirap kami makahanap, and it was not complete. So, the challenge to Andre.
You're saying something.
Yan, Bing.
The Lopez Museum has,
Also,
Ma'am, the Lopez Museum has a copy on microfilm. It's available there.
Under-
Even now, because the exhibit on Joaquin is going on until September.
Askihano de Manila.
The exhibit at the Lopez Museum is entitled, him as
What do you
a
ask a giant?
what as a journalist.
And is it complete?
Or
Or
the
the
free
press?
I think so. They're proud of it, so they must be.
Free press pala, the Asia-Philippines leader. Because ni Joaquin, along with those writers, sila, Greg Brillantes, Kerima Pulot, and Pete Lacaba, they went on strike. And the owners did union bust and set up the Asia-Philippines leader, where Nick continued writing one long essay a week. So I wonder who is going to be able to collect all of this, really, eventually.
Right? So if you're wondering, that's Charo Joaquin Villegas and Bing. They are handling Nick's estate. She is the niece of Nick Joaquin. So that's why they know so much. So,
Sorry, I
Yes,
just wanted to add, maybe Anvil can come up with a collected works where everything that Nick wrote is included. I know that's going to take quite a bit of time, but I think it's a worthwhile project. You know, something to contemplate. Okay, you're on it. Good.
you heard it here first. Questions, please. There.
Does Nick Joaquin have works that are still hidden, kept, and unpublished?
Actually, yes. There are several biographies that are still out there, which were commissioned, and one of them is coming out next year. So just watch out. There will be a new Nick Joaquin biography.
Biography of him?
No. By him.
So, whose biography?
I don't know if the family wants it out yet. Yes. So just watch out. Definitely. Definitely.
For the young people here, prior to his death in 2004, Nick was the preeminent biographer. If you wanted a biography that people would be talking about, you got him. So he was also the most expensive.
Yes.
The 1 million
At the time.
peso man at that time, that was a lot of money, and so that was the amount of money you paid.
A lot of
Nick
beer.
Joaquin, that's a lot of beer.
Yeah.
So more books coming out. There's still a treasure trove of Nick Joaquin works out there that will be coming out. Questions, please. Yes, Jaja.
I think that he wrote a biography, but it did not have endings. In every chapter, there was no ending. Who's the best writer who could end this chapter?
There was the last book that I know someone else finished was the book about the law firm. Accra. And I believe that was Teddy Locsin Jr. who finished that book. So when Nick died, it was unfinished, and Teddy Locsin finished it, essentially.
Actually,
Yes.
actually it was finished,
Okay.
but then Accra sat on it.
Okay.
It was supposed to be for their 25th
Alright.
year, but then they only published it, I think, last year.
Yeah.
So for their 40th. So that's why
They updated
Boy
it.
Locsin had to come in and, you know.
Updated.
Yes, that's right.
What do you guys think? Who do you think should be finishing the unfinished walking books?
No one. I think it should be just left. Don't you think so?
I don't know anyone who would be so brave.
More questions, please. That's a good question. by the way. Yes, in the back, over there.
So for millennials, for example, who've never read Nick Joaquin, you mentioned earlier the usual complaints of students about his work. What particular piece would you recommend they start with that would get them interested?
I totally agree with Rui. I would really start with the reportage. Because I think the millennials will have no problems with it. You can even find those where the issues being dealt with are still current now. Like that thing about drug addicts. And how that young 25-year-old reporter of the Manila Times was already saying even then, why are we treating it as a crime when it is an illness? So yun, ganyan, makakahanap ka ng mga ganong essays niya. And then also the style is less, well, the term has been used, baroque. No? The style for fiction has been described as baroque. His reportage is not baroque. Because it was published as journalism and had to be read every week, diba? It is a pruned down prose. Which is not to say that it was not as good as. In fact, depending on your taste, some readers will prefer that kind of style. So I would introduce Nick Joaquin to the millennials with the reportage.
And add perhaps a question of heroes, the history, like if they're taking history course, why wouldn't if I were the professor, add a question of heroes to whatever official textbook they're using as a more interesting take on histories. If you're looking at figures like Father Burgos, Emilio del Jacinto, Gregorio del I'm mixing up the names now. Gregorio del Pilar, so certainly, and that's written in not in the quote Baroque manner. So I would think that would be a good other book to add to works that might appeal to the millennials. On the other hand, millennials should also be able to write sentences that are fully spelled out. Supposing we read How Do I Love Thee in millennialese, how do I L-U-V-D? That kind of loses the poetry. So in some ways, I would rather the millennials measure up rather than dumbing down Nick Joaquin. That's the challenge of every generation.
That's why when it comes to that, I think with my students, it's more a problem getting them to read than to write. Because they can write, and there's a starting point. A lot of them write on Wattpad, which at least is a starting point for them. So the writing is the easy part actually. The reading part is the bigger challenge. Getting them to develop habits of reading.
To follow up on what Luigi said, another way I think is not to make them read the entire essay. Kasi ang haba eh. They long form naman yung mga sinusulat talaga sa mga magazine noon, di ba yung mga magazine yung mga Rogue, mga Esquire, konti-konti yung text, puro pictures, di ba? So in fact, even the byline is called words. Words by so-and-so. And then photos by, so mas importante yung art direction kaysa yung sumusulat. So, sometimes what I do is I select specific scenes from, for example, his Question of Heroes. They're memorable. Halimbawa, Gregorio, di ba history is very boring the way it's taught? More or less. So, ayun, hirap din yung mga estudyante doon. So, but the way he writes the scene, he would make the scenes come alive. These are one of the things that the scholars did not like. But for me, that's the beauty of it. Like, I remember Gregorio del Pilar, when I read The Hero of Tirad Paz, was the hero of Tirad Paz a henchman or something, gano'n at ang title. And then I remember the memorable picture of he on his white horse. He was like 21 ba or 19. Really young fellow in his white uniform, leading holding the fort so that Aguinaldo could escape. Such a memorable picture of him. So I would take one scene like that and make them read that one first. And then, kung magustuhan nila, do you like more? I remember my I had the real blessing of having a wonderful storyteller for an aunt who lived with us and who was my yaya, kasi right after the war, walang maids. And the way she would force me to, I didn't like to eat. I was pihikan, as they say. She would force me to it by telling me a story, maraming installments, like Gone with the Wind, you know. And she would say, and then Red Butler entered the room and open your mouth. Open my mouth, and she would feed me. Then she would continue, ganun. And Scarlett O'Hara in her green gown like that, and open your mouth. That's how she would get me to it, because I was enthralled by the story. And then, that's how I came to appreciate stories, and maybe that's why I became a storyteller myself. So I'm thinking, if you feed it that way in small doses, like a spoonful of sugar, you mix that, something go down, and medicine go down. So if you think na for the students, mga medicine itong mga classics natin, there are ways of making them attractive. Of course, that means that the professor has to become a kind of showman, ano? Pwede na lang song and dance na lang, ano? I think that's the way. Which way are ya?
I think that I want to add to that if you wanted to teach them fiction, I find trying to explain the short stories to them by way of their peculiarities. For example, the first paragraph of Mayday. I find that I tell them, you think you've seen a long paragraph? Here is a long paragraph. And then they kind of wind up wanting to know what's that thing up with the mirror and the midnight thing. And I think Candida's Apocalypse and The Women Who Had Two Neighbors is a novel, of course. But I mean, if you try to tell them, so this guy thinks he has a double, he sees him around, and as Luigi so well put it earlier, he can see people naked, which in some hands would be something provocative. In his hand, it's almost embarrassing for Bobby. And then in The Woman Who Had Two Neighbors, the lead character is constantly trying to convince people she has two neighbors and that she has to get rid of one of them. And just trying to explain to people this plot. And you think, Nick Joaquin thought of this way, way back. And yet it's, catchy. But the thing is trying to get them to read it. So that's actually the trick. More questions? Yes, over there.
Good evening. So, Nick Joaquin, as everyone knows, is the country's greatest writer in English, and that he has left a lasting legacy on our literature. So, here's my question. If Nick Joaquin himself were to come here to this day and saw the state of our English literature as Filipinos, will he be happy about it, or will he think otherwise? What do you think?
First thing you do is grab a bottle of beer. And then you talk.
In fact, I remember sa UST guest speaker. He went up the stairs again, bringing his bottle, introduced a haba na introduction. And before he started, he just put it down and said, "Huwag na lang. Parang inuman na lang tayo." He left the hall and all the men followed him, all the boys in the audience followed. The girls, we did not follow kasi in my day, women were not supposed to drink. And that bar was a real seedy, sordid place in the Pitan, off the Pitan. Pero, ganyan si Nick. I don't know, but seriously, would he be happy? I think he would be happy with some of them. I mean, for example, the work of Charles Ong, the novel Banyaga. I think he would be, that is a wonderful book. And, well, of course, he even praised, of course, Cripiuson, the great Philippine jungle energy cafe. I think he would like Ilustrado by Miguel Sijuco, no? I think and of course, being Nick, he would know that you are a different generation, using a different idiom, thinking in different ways. I'm sure he would have found a way to use the net himself. He's that kind of person. As would have Jose Rizal, I'm sure he would have had a blog. If he were your contemporary, for sure, and he'd be on Twitter. I don't know about Twitter, though. No, probably not. Not with the example of Trump, right? So,
I remember remember, I think 2 years ago, somebody included Jose Rizal as being a Facebook member. Yeah, so, people did actually, who didn't know who Jose Rizal was, they would post, oh, I like this guy. So, I think Nick, was very adaptable. It's the same principle, language. Didn't matter what generation, if you knew how to use language, he'd praise you. So I think he would find, as Jean points out, a lot to praise. And he's also a very kind and generous soul. He probably had I'm sure he had his dislikes, but he would not necessarily be so, say it out loud.
In fact, I think he would like the writers that come to my mind are writers in Filipino. Eros Atalia, Joy de los Reyes. I'm sure he would encourage people. Lourdes Vera, my gosh, I'm sure Nick would like Lourdes Vera, who writes in English and Filipino. No? So I wouldn't worry. If he came here today, I'm sure he'd first of all invite you all to drink. And tell you that he thinks a lot of the literature you produce. Very rin pala yung
I honestly think that Nick would like the blogs, but he wouldn't like Wattpad. I think that because he wouldn't want people meddling with his story. I think he would write his story and he would like people to comment on it, but he wouldn't want people actively interfering, because that's what Wattpad does, right? So I think he can go. I don't think he would like the 140 letter limit of Twitter. I think he would feel absolutely limited by that. He would love the blogs and the ability to instantly publish your stories. That is very much. He would be writing all week and just publish stuff and publish stuff and publish stuff, and people would read it. So I think he would fit very well. Jojo, you were going to say something?
Yeah. Did he take anyone under his wing? Did he consciously coach a number of?
I don't think he coached in the way that you mean, no, but he had a lot of proteges, if you want, no? They would travel with him, barkada niya. Mga estudyante, most of them. Of course, his barkada sila great brillante sa Free Press, but he also had he would identify students whom he thought were promising, and he would pal around with them, he would drink with them, and he would help them find jobs. Yeah, he would place them in newspapers, di ba? And would be ninong to their children and all that.
The first time I met Nick was because of Pete Lacaba.
Yeah.
And Pete and I were just starting out, I was working in a corporate, whom I won't name. And Pete was writing already for the Philippines Free Press because of Nick. And so the first time I met Nick, first thing we do is go to the cafeteria. And I won't tell you what we had to drink. And, he didn't really coach in the sense of sitting down and critiquing what he wrote. It was just by osmosis. You read him, you talked to him, you found out what he was like as a person. But he wasn't one, to lead a workshop. So he taught in other ways.
May I add something?
Sure.
I think he did a panel in a workshop in UP, and the girl whose work was being workshop cried. And then he said, I'm never going to teach in a workshop. Why is she crying? He said, I'm never going to teach in a workshop. And I have a personal experience with him. I didn't know him personally yet, but I said, after years and years and years, I got the courage to send him a short story for the Free Press. And the editors in those days, they never bothered to tell you kung rejected ka ba, kung hindi, di ba? You just never saw your manuscript again, that means rejected. Or suddenly, some months later, you saw it in the Free Press. I sent him a story, and then he was nice enough to send it back to me. Kaya lang may comment, he was rejecting it. Nilagay niya dun sa upper right-hand corner, this story should be cut by 2/3. I was devastated. It took me a whole year to decide to get up the courage to revise it, and then I sent it. He did publish it, and I thought, wow, I have a chance to win the Free Press Award. And then martial law was declared. Free Press was shut down.
I think there's an interesting story there also when talking about Nick Joaquin and proteges, because the writer most identified with Nick in terms of that is Pete. But Pete Lacaba writes completely different from Nick. And I think that this is something you will see with the people that Nick was encouraging. No one writes like him. All of these people, he encouraged them to write their own thing. So none of them sound like him. An entire generation of writers, especially the people who were hanging out in the free press and drinking with Nick, these people, they went on to write different things, but all of them were encouraged by Nick, who would be willing to read your work, but he would be honest. If you asked him, be careful. Because I love the fact that we just discovered Jim Hidalgo rejection letter, which is very rare. Right? I've never heard of one before. But that was how, if we talk about Nick's legacy, perhaps one of the things that I think we miss the most in terms of his presence would have been his ability to inspire other people to write different things. Just write a lot, I think, would be what he would, and write only good stuff. I think he would be very strict about that. Okay, we have time for one more question.
Yes.
Good evening. I'm pretty much aware na he wrote mostly in English. However, is there any even just one single work that he wrote in Filipino? Because well, in my previous wala talaga. I mean, like, wala. Even private writings.
He wrote in Spanish.
He wrote in Spanish.
Spanish.
He spoke Spanish. And a lot of the work that's available in Filipino is actually translated. Like, you can read him in Filipino, but that's already a translation. He never wrote in Filipino.
But at least did he recognize the need or to write in the Filipino language?
I think he wrote a screenplay. Diba? A film
No, but it was in English.
in English.
And it was still translated
Someone
to
else.
Filipino.
I should explain this, that during Nick's time, English was the language of commerce. That's what he was engaged in, which was writing in English. So I don't think that it was any nationalistic thing, but this was what he was good at. He wrote in Spanish, he wrote a lot in English, and that's the work that we have today. I don't think he was really pushing an agenda or anything like that. It just so happened. That's what. It's just like the way he never learned to use the computer, right? The famous story about Nick was he always used a typewriter. To the day he died, he was using a manual typewriter. So it's one of those things where it's not that he hates computers, but he loves typing, and that's sort of what he was for. Probably one more question if there's anyone. Okay.
I'm sure he had these friends, no? Did he love Adrian Cristobal? I mean, did he like him? I mean, he had probably had levels of affection for writers, no? How was his relationship with some of these writers? That's my question.
Unlike other writers whose names will go unmentioned, I never heard him attack any writer. He never did, and especially the young. He was only ever supportive.
I particularly mentioned Adrian because he was with the Marcoses, no?
Yeah, but even then he did not attack people.
Well, he did stop writing for a while.
Yes, he stopped writing for a while, and he returned to it. At least that's how the story goes. When he heard that Pete Lacaba was very seriously ill in prison, and he offered to write again if they would release Pete Lacaba, and the Marcoses did. Totoo ba yung kwento na yun?
Actually, he would accept the National Artist Award. He did not want the National Artist Award.
But he accepted it.
But he accepted it on condition that Pete be released.
Yes.
So other than that, he was not going to accept it because it was
And the Marcoses really wanted him to accept it.
Yes.
Because he was like really.
He had no credibility naman.
Yeah.
Other writers would win and not be in.
Charo, we talked about this before, right? He actually said no already to it, and then when we discovered that Pete was there, that became the condition. So that's how he became a national artist during the Marcos era. All right. Thank you, everybody. We'd like to thank our panelists. Thank you to all of you. We'd like to thank Anvil. Please buy the new edition of the books. If you don't have them or you have the old ones, nice covers. Have a new one. Enjoy the rest of the Philippine Readers and Writers Festival. Thank you and good evening.